You just ruined your own career over a cup of coffee, an elderly customer whispered under his breath. But nobody in the executive lounge paid attention because every eye was fixed on the tall white manager standing near the polished marble counter with a smug smile spreading across his face as fresh coffee slowly dripped from the front of a quiet black man's charcoal jacket and landed on the spotless floor one dark drop at a time, like a countdown nobody understood yet. The room had been silent only seconds earlier, filled with the low hum of laptops, muted phone calls, and the soft jazz floating through hidden speakers. But now the air felt heavier than the July heat outside downtown Chicago. Ethan Brooks straightened his expensive tie and looked at the man in front of him as if he had just corrected a problem instead of creating one. People who don't belong in executive spaces should know when to leave, he said loud enough for everyone to hear, earning a few awkward smiles and even a nervous laugh from someone waiting for a meeting near the windows overlooking the river. The man simply looked down at the coffee soaking into his jacket sleeve, reached into his pocket, and unfolded a plain white handkerchief with calm precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He didn't even look angry. Marcus Bennett quietly wiped the stain as though the coffee mattered less than the character of the person who spilled it. That silence confused everyone more than any confrontation could have. A woman carrying a leather portfolio stopped walking. Two young consultants exchanged uncertain glances. A delivery driver paused near the entrance without realizing it. Even the receptionist slowly lowered her headset. Ethan mistook the silence for surrender and stepped closer, folding his arms across his chest with growing confidence. "If you have a meeting here, show me proof," he said. Marcus folded the handkerchief neatly and slipped it back into his pocket before lifting his eyes for the first time. They were calm, steady, and impossible to read. For one brief moment Ethan felt something unfamiliar, a tiny hesitation that disappeared as quickly as it arrived. He shook it off and gestured toward the elevators reserved for executive members. "Those aren't for people dressed like you." Marcus glanced toward the brushed steel doors, then toward the wall displaying framed photographs of company milestones stretching back 20 years. A faint smile almost appeared before fading again. Across the lounge, a young operations assistant named Emily Carter quietly opened a tablet to verify the day's visitor schedule, mostly because something about the quiet man's composure didn't match the humiliation unfolding in front of her. Around them, whispers began spreading from table to table like ripples across still water, while another drop of coffee slipped from Marcus Bennett's sleeve onto the marble floor, and without anyone realizing it, that tiny stain had already started changing every career inside the room. Marcus Bennett finished wiping the last trace of coffee from his sleeve with the same steady movement a man might use to straighten a picture frame, and that quiet gesture unsettled the executive lounge more than any argument ever could. Nobody understood why a person who had just been embarrassed in front of dozens of strangers looked completely unshaken. The silence stretched across the polished room until the gentle sound of a fountain near the glass wall became impossible to ignore. Ethan Brooks noticed people watching and mistook their attention for approval. His confidence grew with every passing second. He adjusted his jacket, glanced around the lounge, and smiled as if he had protected an exclusive space from someone who did not deserve to enter it. "Executive membership means standards," he announced, speaking to the room instead of the man standing a few feet away. A middle-aged businessman slowly closed his laptop, but said nothing. A woman waiting for a conference call looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to interrupt. Marcus simply picked up the leather portfolio resting beside his chair and brushed an invisible speck of dust from the cover. His movements were patient, deliberate, almost effortless, the kind of composure built over decades rather than moments. Emily Carter continued studying the visitor system on her tablet. She expected to find a scheduling error or a misplaced reservation, but the screen displayed something that immediately made her sit a little straighter. The visitor profile carried an unrestricted executive authorization level, a status she had only seen during training. She refreshed the page once, then twice. The same name appeared again, Marcus Bennett. She looked from the screen to the quiet man standing near the marble counter, and then toward Ethan, who was still speaking with growing arrogance. "You can wait downstairs until someone confirms your appointment," Ethan said. "That is how professional organizations operate." Marcus finally answered, his voice calm enough that several people leaned closer just to hear it. Interesting. I was under the impression that professionalism started with respect. The sentence was simple, almost gentle, yet it settled over the room like fresh snow. Nobody laughed. Even the receptionist stopped typing. Ethan forced a smile that looked thinner than before. Respect is earned, he replied. Marcus nodded once, as if considering the statement. Sometimes it is revealed. Emily quietly opened another internal page reserved for management records. The same profile appeared with additional permissions extending far beyond ordinary executive access. She felt her heartbeat quicken. Something about the room had changed, although nobody else seemed to recognize it yet. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, afternoon sunlight reflected off the Chicago River, filling the lounge with warm gold light that contrasted sharply with the growing tension inside. Guests who had planned to leave remained in their seats. Conversations faded into whispers. Coffee cups cooled untouched on polished tables. Marcus Bennett stood perfectly still in the center of it all, wearing a stained jacket and an expression of complete calm, while the invisible balance of power quietly began shifting in a direction that only one person in the room could already see. The quiet only encouraged Ethan Brooks to keep performing for the audience gathering around him. He took one slow step toward Marcus Bennett and casually picked up another paper coffee cup from the refreshment station, turning it in his hand as though he were delivering a lesson instead of creating a scene. Confidence is easy when somebody else pays the bills, he said with a smile that invited agreement. A young financial analyst forced a laugh before immediately regretting it. Nobody else joined in. The executive lounge had become strangely still, filled with people who sensed something important without understanding why. Marcus glanced toward the floor where the earlier drops of coffee had already been cleaned by an employee who quietly disappeared without saying a word. His expression never changed. He simply adjusted the cuff of his shirt beneath the stained jacket and checked the silver watch on his wrist. Ethan noticed the gesture and misunderstood it completely. Running late for an interview? He asked. Do yourself a favor and try the public lobby downstairs. This level is reserved for leaders. Marcus answered with the same calm tone that had unsettled the room from the beginning. Leadership is usually recognized by how people treat strangers. The sentence drifted across the lounge and settled into an uncomfortable silence. Near the reception desk, Emily Carter continued reading the executive profile on her tablet. Every additional page raised more questions than the last. Ownership authorization, unlimited building access, corporate governance credentials, confidential designation. She blinked several times, convinced she had opened the wrong file, but the photograph matched the man standing only 20 feet away wearing a coffee-stained jacket and ordinary brown shoes. Her pulse quickened. She looked toward Ethan and almost spoke before stopping herself. Across the room, two senior consultants quietly exchanged whispers. One leaned closer and said, "That man has not defended himself once." The other replied, "Maybe he does not have to." Ethan was too focused on his own voice to notice the atmosphere changing around him. He motioned toward the elevators again and addressed the growing audience instead of Marcus. Our company was built on excellence, not appearances designed to fool people. The words hung in the air, sharper than he intended, causing several guests to shift uncomfortably in their seats. An older woman waiting for a client meeting slowly closed her notebook and looked directly at Marcus with quiet sympathy. Marcus simply nodded to her with effortless courtesy before returning his attention to Ethan. There was no anger in his face, only patience that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Emily finally took one careful step away from the reception desk, tablet still in her hands. She knew the information on her screen could change everything happening inside the lounge, yet something told her to wait just a little longer. Outside, sunlight reflected across the river and filled the windows with gold, while inside every conversation faded into silence. Ethan believed he controlled the room because he was the loudest voice in it, never realizing that true authority had been standing quietly in front of him from the very beginning. Emily Carter slowly lowered the brightness on her tablet, as if dimming the screen might somehow slow the realization racing through her mind. She had joined the company less than 8 months earlier, and every training session repeated the same rule without exception. Owner-level credentials never appeared by accident. They were protected behind multiple layers of authorization that ordinary employees could not alter, duplicate, or request. She refreshed the profile one more time, and the same information appeared again beside the calm photograph of Marcus Bennett. Executive ownership access, unlimited facility authorization, permanent governance clearance. She quietly looked across the lounge where Marcus stood with effortless composure while the stain on his jacket remained the only visible evidence that anything unusual had happened. Ethan Brooks continued speaking with complete confidence, unaware that every confident sentence pushed him closer to a mistake he could no longer undo. "We work hard to maintain standards here," he announced while glancing around the room for approval. Nobody answered. The silence felt different now. It no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to observation. A young attorney waiting near the windows slowly placed his phone on the table without taking his eyes off Marcus. An elderly couple stopped discussing their travel plans. Even the barista polishing coffee cups behind the counter slowed to a stop. Emily walked toward the receptionist and quietly whispered, "Can you verify this profile for me?" The receptionist entered the identification number and immediately froze. She looked at Emily, then at Marcus, then back at the screen. "This cannot be right," she murmured, yet the system confirmed the record with another green authorization symbol. Emily felt a responsibility much heavier than her employee badge resting against her blazer. She remembered her supervisor saying during orientation that integrity was measured by the decisions people made when nobody expected courage from them. Across the lounge, Marcus noticed the brief exchange, but gave no sign that he was watching. Instead, he calmly straightened the portfolio resting against his chair and glanced toward the city skyline beyond the glass walls, as if the afternoon meeting still mattered more than the growing tension surrounding him. Ethan interpreted that quiet confidence as indifference. "You have had enough time," he said with another practiced smile. "Perhaps it is time to accept that this space is not meant for everyone." Marcus turned his attention back to him and answered in a voice so steady that every word seemed to settle gently across the polished marble floor. "Sometimes a room reveals more about the people inside it than the person standing alone." No one laughed. Emily took another step forward, holding the tablet close to her chest. She had not spoken yet because timing mattered, and instinct told her that truth carried the greatest weight when everyone had already chosen a side. Around the executive lounge, conversations disappeared completely, replaced by quiet expectation, while afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor and reached the polished shoes of Marcus Bennett, the only person in the building who seemed perfectly at peace with what was about to happen. Marcus Bennett rested one hand lightly on the handle of his leather portfolio and watched a single ray of afternoon sunlight stretch across the marble floor until it touched the edge of his polished shoes. The moment felt strangely familiar. Years earlier, when he was 22 years old and wearing the only suit he could afford, he had walked into a corporate office carrying a folder full of ideas and impossible optimism. The receptionist had looked at him, looked at the conference room behind her, and politely suggested that job applicants should wait by the freight elevator instead of the executive lobby. Nobody raised a voice that day. Nobody insulted him directly. They simply decided where they believed he belonged. Marcus remembered sitting alone with a paper cup of coffee growing cold beside him while executives walked past without making eye contact. He had promised himself something during that long afternoon. If success ever found him, he would never measure another human being by clothing, skin color, or first impressions. The memory faded as quickly as it arrived, replaced by the quiet executive lounge where dozens of strangers were now measuring him for exactly those reasons. Ethan Brooks checked his watch and exhaled dramatically. "We have already spent enough time on this," he announced. "Please understand that certain areas are reserved for people with verified executive standing." Marcus met his eyes with calm patience. "Verification is important," he replied softly. "So is judgment." Ethan shook his head, convinced he was winning an argument that Marcus had never joined. Around them, the atmosphere continued changing in almost invisible ways. The attorney near the window remained seated instead of leaving for his meeting. The elderly couple quietly exchanged concerned glances. The barista stopped preparing fresh coffee and watched from behind the counter. Emily Carter held her tablet so tightly that her fingers pressed against the protective case. Every line of information confirmed the same unbelievable truth, and every passing second made her silence feel heavier. The receptionist looked toward her and whispered, "Should someone call corporate?" Emily hesitated before answering. "I think corporate already knows exactly who he is." Marcus calmly removed the stained jacket and folded it over one arm without a trace of frustration. The simple white shirt beneath it was perfectly pressed, and the coffee stain no longer seemed like an accident. It looked like evidence quietly waiting for the right moment. Ethan noticed the movement and mistook composure for surrender once again. "That is better," he said with a satisfied smile. "Now we are making progress." Marcus glanced toward the city skyline glowing beyond the glass walls, and then back toward the people silently watching the exchange. His voice remained steady enough to almost disappear into the room. "Progress begins when someone chooses respect before recognition." The words settled into the still air while Emily took one determined step forward, realizing that the next decision she made would define not only the afternoon, but the kind of professional she wanted to become for the rest of her career. Emily Carter finally took a steady breath and stepped away from the reception desk, but before she could speak, Marcus Bennett calmly reached into his pocket and removed a simple black phone that looked no different from anyone else's in the lounge. He tapped the screen once and held it to his ear while the room remained perfectly still. "Olivia," he said in a quiet voice that barely rose above the sound of the fountain, "please begin Executive Protocol 7. There was no urgency, no anger, no dramatic pause. Only calm certainty. A warm professional voice answered immediately. "Confirmed, Mr. Bennett. Protocol 7 is now active." Marcus thanked her and ended the call before placing the phone back into his pocket. Ethan Brooks laughed softly and looked around the lounge for support. "Executive Protocol 7, he repeated with amusement. "That sounds impressive." A few uneasy smiles appeared but disappeared almost instantly. The receptionist suddenly noticed her computer screen refresh without warning. A small gold banner appeared across the top, displaying "Internal Executive Verification in Progress." At nearly the same moment, every manager-level tablet inside the lounge received the same silent notification. Emily looked down and watched new security indicators illuminate one after another beside Marcus Bennett's profile. Owner-level credentials verified. Governance access confirmed. Corporate presence detected on site. She felt her heartbeat quicken. Across the room, an elevator that was rarely used opened without making a sound. Two professionally dressed executives stepped into the hallway and quietly checked messages on their phones before looking toward the lounge entrance. They did not rush. They simply began walking with the confidence of people following a schedule that had existed long before anyone else realized it. Ethan remained unaware and continued speaking. "You should save your imagination for a movie script," he said with another smile directed at Marcus. Marcus looked toward the windows where afternoon sunlight reflected across the Chicago River like polished glass. "Reality usually requires less imagination than assumptions," he replied. The attorney near the window slowly stood, not to leave, but to watch more closely. The elderly couple remained seated with untouched coffee cups between them. The barista quietly straightened every cup on the counter despite none of them needing attention. The entire lounge seemed to be waiting for something invisible to arrive. Emily finally reached Marcus and lowered her voice. "Sir, I think there has been a serious misunderstanding." Marcus met her eyes and offered a small, respectful nod. "Thank you for checking instead of guessing." Those 8 words carried more kindness than anything spoken during the entire afternoon. Emily felt both relieved and nervous at the same time. Behind her, the receptionist's monitor refreshed once again, this time displaying a gold company emblem reserved for ownership notifications. She covered her mouth in surprise. Ethan noticed everyone looking away from him and frowned for the first time. He glanced around the room, sensing the atmosphere changing even though he could not yet understand why. The polished executive lounge had not become louder. It had become quieter, and in that growing silence the confidence that filled Ethan only minutes earlier began slipping away, while Marcus Bennett stood exactly where he had been all along, patient, composed, and completely certain that truth never needed to raise its voice. The quiet footsteps coming from the private executive elevator sounded almost gentle, yet every person inside the lounge instinctively turned toward them. 2 senior corporate officers crossed the marble floor with calm professionalism, followed by the regional legal director and the head of operations. each carrying a tablet displaying the same gold ownership seal that had silently appeared throughout the building only moments earlier. Nobody announced their arrival. Nobody needed to. The atmosphere shifted before a single word was spoken. Ethan Brooks straightened his jacket and stepped forward with renewed confidence, convinced that management had arrived to support his decision. "Perfect timing," he said with an eager smile. "We have an unauthorized visitor refusing to follow executive access policy." The regional legal director looked at Ethan for less than a second before continuing toward Marcus Bennett. The room became so still that the quiet sound of polished shoes crossing marble echoed through the lounge. Emily Carter lowered her tablet and held her breath. The receptionist slowly stood from her chair without realizing she had done so. The elderly couple exchanged a glance that said everything words could not. Reaching Marcus, the head of operations smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bennett. Welcome back. We apologize for the delay." Marcus accepted the handshake with effortless calm. "Good afternoon, Daniel. Thank you for coming." The legal director nodded respectfully before speaking. "The board is already aware that Executive Protocol 7 has been activated." Ethan blinked once, then twice, as though the words belonged to someone else's conversation. His confident posture slowly disappeared. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said quietly. No one answered him immediately. Marcus looked around the executive lounge, meeting the eyes of the guests who had silently witnessed everything from the beginning. Then he turned back toward Ethan and spoke in the same measured voice that had never once risen above normal conversation. "You never asked who owned this building. You decided who belonged inside it." Every person in the lounge remained silent. Marcus continued, not with anger but with unmistakable clarity. "You judged a stained jacket before you recognized decades of work. You measured appearance instead of character. That is not leadership. That is assumption." The words landed with more force than any raised voice ever could. Emily felt a wave of relief knowing she had trusted the facts instead of the crowd. The receptionist quietly wiped away a tear she could not explain. Even the attorney near the window nodded in quiet agreement. Ethan looked toward the executives surrounding Marcus and finally noticed that every conversation, every decision, every glance in the room now flowed toward the man he had dismissed only minutes earlier. The coffee stain remained visible against the folded jacket resting over Marcus Bennett's arm, but somehow it no longer looked like a mark of embarrassment. It had become a silent reminder that dignity never disappears when respect does. And as afternoon light filled the executive lounge with warm gold reflections, everyone present understood that the quietest person in the room had possessed the greatest authority from the very beginning. No applause broke the silence because the moment did not need celebration to carry weight. The truth had already changed the room. The regional legal director quietly turned toward Ethan Brooks and opened a tablet displaying the company governance portal. A single notification appeared across the screen, followed by another and then another, each confirming that Executive Protocol 7 had completed its review. Ethan reached for the employee badge clipped to his jacket as though touching it might restore the confidence that had disappeared only minutes earlier. Instead, a soft tone sounded from the access system beside the executive elevator, and the indicator next to his profile shifted from green to gray. Nobody announced what it meant. Every employee present already understood. The head of operations spoke with calm professionalism. "Your building management privileges have been temporarily suspended pending a formal review in accordance with company policy." There was no anger in his voice and no satisfaction on his face. Only procedure carried out exactly as written. Ethan lowered his eyes for the first time that afternoon. Marcus Bennett watched quietly, showing no sign of triumph. He simply folded the stained jacket over his arm and stood with the same composed posture that had defined every moment since he entered the lounge. Emily Carter remained beside the reception desk until the legal director turned toward her. "Miss Carter, your verification work prevented a larger failure of corporate standards. Thank you for choosing facts over assumptions." Emily almost looked behind herself, convinced he must have been speaking to someone else. When she realized he was not, she smiled with quiet disbelief. The receptionist exhaled a nervous laugh and finally relaxed her shoulders. The attorney near the window gathered his laptop and nodded respectfully toward Marcus before leaving for his meeting. The elderly couple stood and walked past him, the gentleman offering a simple handshake while his wife said, kindness always tells the truth before titles do. Marcus returned the gesture with genuine warmth. The barista disappeared for a moment and returned carrying a fresh cup of coffee. "On the house, sir," he said. Marcus accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you, but next time let us share one together." The young employee smiled as though the invitation mattered more than any reward. Around the lounge, conversations slowly returned, yet they sounded different now. People spoke more softly, greeted strangers more naturally, and held doors open without thinking. It was as if one quiet lesson had reshaped an entire afternoon. Ethan remained standing near the marble counter, no longer the center of attention, but simply another person reflecting on choices that could not be taken back. Marcus glanced once more at the faint stains still visible on his folded jacket, and then toward the golden light filling the executive lounge. Respect had not arrived because everyone finally recognized who he was. Respect arrived because the truth had finally become impossible to ignore, and in that quiet realization the building felt a little larger, a little fairer, and a little closer to the values written on the company walls every employee walked past each morning. The executive lounge slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, yet nothing inside it was truly the same. Afternoon sunlight painted long golden reflections across the marble floor where a few minutes earlier silence had carried embarrassment, uncertainty, and judgment. Now the same quiet carried something entirely different. Understanding. Marcus Bennett accepted the fresh cup of coffee with both hands and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. He stood there for a moment, watching boats move across the river while conversations quietly resumed behind him. Emily Carter approached with careful steps, still holding the tablet that had changed the course of the afternoon. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly, "I almost stayed silent." Marcus smiled without turning around. "Almost is where character begins. You chose the harder path." Emily looked at the city beyond the glass and nodded, knowing she would remember those words for the rest of her career. Nearby, the receptionist greeted a delivery driver with unexpected warmth, and the barista welcomed a maintenance employee with the same smile normally reserved for executives. Small moments spread through the lounge like light through open windows. Nobody instructed them to change. They simply had. The regional legal director quietly confirmed that every review would follow company policy and every employee would receive additional leadership training centered on respect, fairness, and professional conduct. Marcus approved the recommendation immediately. "People grow when standards rise," he said. "Our goal is not to embarrass anyone. Our goal is to build something better." Even Ethan Brooks looked up when he heard those words. There was no public lecture, no humiliation returned for humiliation received, only an opportunity to reflect on choices and consequences. The coffee stain remained on Marcus's folded jacket, visible but fading as the fabric slowly dried. Daniel from operations glanced toward it and offered to have the company replace it with a new one. Marcus gently shook his head. "No, I think I will keep this one." Daniel smiled with quiet understanding. Guests gradually left for meetings, each carrying a slightly different version of the same story. Some would remember the calm voice. Some would remember the silence. Others would remember the young employee who trusted facts instead of assumptions. But every one of them would remember the man who never needed to raise his voice to change an entire room. As the executive elevator doors opened one final time, Marcus placed the untouched cup of fresh coffee on a nearby table and slipped into the folded jacket once more, stain and all. He straightened the collar, looked once around the lounge, and spoke a single sentence that settled gently over everyone still present. "Coffee washes away with water. Character stays with us long after the stain is gone." No one answered because no answer was necessary. The elevator doors closed, carrying him upward while warm sunlight continued filling the executive lounge. And for the first time that afternoon, every person who remained understood that true leadership is never announced by a title, never proven by a suit, and never diminished by the assumptions of strangers.